Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the CEOs for Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for life science companies. We've helped companies over the last 12 years across the globe do things like virtual advisory boards, focus groups, medical education, brand plan rollouts, and everything in between. But more importantly, at Impetus Digital, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with the provocateurs of the world, the people who are in the leading edge spaces in healthcare, the digital entrepreneurs and thinkers, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm actually super excited to have one of these digital thinkers and entrepreneurs in the healthcare space, Liam Kaufman. Liam Kaufman is actually the CEO and co-founder of a really cool company called Winterlight Labs. This is actually a company that's developed AI-based technology that detects cognitive impairment with as little as 1 minute of speech. So we're going to want to dig into that because that is really, really cool stuff. Liam completed his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and an MSc in Medicine in Medical Science. So he has been researching eye movement for detection of Alzheimer's disease. So we all know that this is actually an encroaching condition, especially with our aging population. So this is so pivotal and timely. He has years of experience writing software and leading teams of software developers in a very professional environment. He has authored multiple peer-reviewed scientific publications in neuroscience, cognitive neurology, and human-computer interaction. In 2012, Liam launched Understood It, sort of like Reddit, but Understood It. It's a classroom polling app that was acquired in 2013 by EventMobi. So welcome, Liam. So happy to have you on our show today.
Thanks for having me.
That's awesome. So very exciting trajectory. You obviously have all kinds of interesting things in your career. So I was interested, not everybody knows at an early age that they want to get into neuroscience or cognitive neurology. It's not normally part of regular curriculum. So how did you ever get interested in that as well as in human-computer interaction?
Yeah, for sure. So I was really fortunate to be given a couple books in my first and second year of university. So the first was Phantoms in the Brain by V.S. Ramachandran, and then the other is Anthropologists on Mars by Oliver Sacks. And I found both books absolutely fascinating, and that sort of opened a window for me. And so after that, I actually switched from computer science to neuroscience. And I think what kind of kept me there was the fact that it's like this really interesting intersection between psychology and biology, and it includes all sort of like the rigors of science, but it also has this more human flavor.
And you bring up something that's really interesting, is that you switched from computer science into neuroscience. There's got to be some bridging and some similarities. What have you found were some of those connection points that you were able to translate from the computer to your understanding of how the brain works?
For sure. So, and just to be clear, later on in my career, I actually ended up going back and doing an undergrad degree in computer science. So in the end, I still got that degree in computer science. I think the overlap for me was really about like the sort of intrinsic motivation in writing code and analyzing data in neuroscience. It provides sort of a different pleasure, which is like you get to make things. So in most science, you're really learning about things, but in engineering and computer science, you're creating things, which from like a creative standpoint is really exciting.
But I think it's also important for people to realize that the circuitry of how a computer works is very similar to the way a brain works in terms of networks and the way they fire and connect, and really at the end of the day, machine learning and neural networks. Can you paint a little bit of a simplified picture about some of that correlation?
Yeah, so I mean, like the way that computers work is like binary ones and zeros, and the way that neurons work is there's typically sort of like a threshold of activation. So it's kind of like all or nothing. And you have these networks of neurons within the brain, in the same way that you might have like networks of transistors in a computer chip. And over the last sort of 10 years, deep neural networks have taken off, which is sort of like a rough software proxy for some of these networks in the brain as well.
Fantastic. So you have gone off with all of this fantastic, super specialized knowledge to founding a company called Winterlight Labs. Can you explain to the listeners here, what is Winterlight Labs and what is your core objectives?
Yeah, for sure. So at Winterlight Labs, we make speech-based digital biomarkers for measuring disease severity, disease progression in neurology and psychiatry. The company was founded in 2015. It was a spin out from the University of Toronto. And at the time, I was really interested in getting back into this intersection between computer science and neuroscience. And I started to reach out to colleagues at the university. I was introduced to one of my co-founders, Frank Rudzik, a computer scientist. And he was doing really interesting research on taking speech and using that as an objective way of assessing people with dementia. And so it turns out that when you have dementia, you have, or specifically Alzheimer's disease, you have word finding difficulties. And so this will manifest in longer pauses, more frequent pauses. You tend to forget the names of people, places, and things. So you use fewer nouns and you compensate by using more pronouns. You tend to use simpler words. So instead of saying the word like SUV or sedan, you might just say car. And first this was like fascinating that you can do this, but what was really neat was when we started to talk to physicians, specifically like neurologists and psychiatrists. None of them are really surprised because they've been picking up on these changes in language their entire career, but they can't really put a number on it. Like they don't like count the number of nouns when they talk to someone, but they kind of pick up like the gist or like the overall gestalt of this person's state through speech. And so they might ask them, how are your children doing, your grandchildren? How are the holidays? And when they're having this conversation, they're picking up all this information that they use as part of this diagnosis. And so really what we're doing at Winterlight is we're taking all these variables that specialist physicians can perceive, and in some cases they can't even perceive. And we're coming up with like a very easy way of kind of scaling that, democratizing that type of measurement to make aspects of neurology and psychiatry much more objective and moving away from these pen and paper subjective assessments that were created in the 1980s, 90s, et cetera, to a much more rigorous way of evaluating someone.
So for Winterlight Labs, Liam, who is technically your customer? Like now that you're out there and you're looking for people to sign up or sign on, how are you specifically targeting and who are you targeting?
For sure. So creating a company from scratch is super difficult. Creating a healthcare company from scratch is an order of magnitude more difficult. We were really fortunate that we came or we created the company when we did. We're at the sort of the right place at the right time. In 2016, 2017, we had conversations with physicians, senior care companies, payers, providers, pharmaceutical companies. And what we learned was that there was an incredibly high failure rate within clinical trials for neurology and psychiatry. And so a lot of these pharma companies were going back to the drawing board and figuring out how can we improve the outcome of these trials. And one of the things that they identified was the measurement tools. So they spend effectively $1 billion developing a new drug, and then they use a pen and paper test from the 1980s to figure out if that drug works or not. And there was a sort of general acceptance that these tools were inadequate or in some cases just bad. So in 2017, they put together these digital biomarker groups to really start to evaluate these new technologies, whether it's speech, eye movements, activity patterns, sleep, et cetera. And so we started to work with pharma companies on an R&D basis. And really what we do now is we partner with pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies to help them in their clinical trials and their clinical research. So the premise is, are people getting better on these new drugs? So that's one use case. We're really sort of scratching the surface with that use case. So increasingly, because this sort of explosion of digital health, especially in the last sort of 6 months, more and more companies are coming to us and saying, we have our own digital therapeutic, our own cognitive assessment, telemedicine, et cetera, and we want to plug in your digital biomarkers into our platform. And so really our goal is to kind of open up this platform that we've created, partner with these different companies so that they can use the technology in a variety of different settings.
So it almost becomes like almost like an Amazon, or if you ever remember the headset Muse, where they became a platform where a lot of people were starting to do research using those tools, and it creates like an ecosystem. Is that sort of the
Exactly.
vision for Winterlight? Are you looking at an API and like lots of simultaneous research using your tools? Is that what the vision is?
Yeah, for sure. And I think part of that came from this difficult decision that we had, which was there's sort of like an acknowledgement that we had that multimodal assessments were the future. Speech, obviously, we're biased, and we felt that was really an important part of it. But ultimately, the best way to capture someone's overall behavior is to not just look at speech, but also look at eye movements, activity patterns, facial expression, gait, etc. And as a company, though, we wanted to focus on what we're good at, which is speech and language. And there's enough there to really create a company out of. And so to actualize or to achieve that dream, we really have to look to partnerships. So we can maintain our focus on speech and language, be the experts, the leaders in speech and language, while seeing this overall vision through.
Yeah, fascinating. And I love that, I love the fact that there's clarity and focus, because that's one of the things that you see a lot with startup companies who will end up running after the next cool thing and then try to bite off too much and then really losing that focus. So it's really cool and really awesome that you're really staying laser focused and then partnering with other people to add in the bells and whistles. So let's talk a little bit about some of these key areas that you are targeting with this natural language processing and algorithm and assessment, which is really around clinical research. So this obviously has lots of ramifications with everything from physicians, allied healthcare providers, payers, and of course, pharma companies around discovery and managing and maintaining and sustaining and adhering with patients over the long term some of their conditions. Can you talk a little bit around what you're doing in the neurodegenerative areas around things like MS and Parkinson's and other sorts of things?
Yeah, so what's interesting with the technology that we've created in our general approach is that instead of just focusing on the sound of a person's voice or just the linguistics, the content, we do both. And so we've put a lot of effort into expanding the breadth of the different variables that we can extract from language. We've also put a lot of effort into being able to do this from different types of speech. So not just people describing a picture or doing like a neuropsychological assessment or reading a sentence, but also looking at conversations, phone calls, etc. And what that allows us to do is analyze many more types of therapeutic areas. So with Parkinson's, it's a motor disorder and it changes the sound of your speech. With Alzheimer's disease, it does change a bit of the sound, but also really changes the content, the words that you choose, etc. And so what we can do is we can apply this technology to a lot of different therapeutic areas. And so typically we partner with academic clinicians at different teaching hospitals. They either have speech that they've collected for other purposes, and we can use that as a starting point to validate the technology. But what's neat though is that there's actually decades of research out there showing that you can quantify these different diseases through speech. And so really what we're doing is we're replicating that science, but also creating the infrastructure for scaling that analysis.
And it really makes one ask the question, because we're now in this forum now where smart units and Siris and the Alexas of the world are at everybody's home. We're now hitting this new Christmas and Black Fridays, and everybody's populating their homes with these smart machines who are very integrated with voice. What is Winterlight considering in terms of potential collaborations or building on top of these other algorithms in terms of ambient biometrics? By utilizing day-to-day interactions with these machines, how can that data be absorbed into a democratized data lake?
So right now we're focused on active assessment. So I think what you're referring to is more of a passive assessment. And one of the advantages of passive assessment is it reduces the friction. So you're basically getting additional data from something that someone would already do in their day-to-day. There's a couple of big challenges. One is, in many cases, the amount of speech is much, much smaller. It's almost scripted. There's still data there that we can use, but that's one challenge. The other is that a lot of these platforms don't have open APIs, and so we can't actually analyze the content or the raw audio in some cases. The other is just the sheer amount of data. So it could be, hours per day as opposed to a couple of minutes. And then the other is privacy and ethical concerns, which I think are huge. I think, or I know most people don't want to be diagnosed by their Alexa. And so the approach that Amazon has taken, so they have this wrist watch band wearable that effectively passively collects speech all the time. And what they've done is they've put a lot of effort into making sure that it doesn't go to the cloud. So from a privacy perspective, it's all analyzed on their phone. But they've also sort of focused on like a wellness angle. So it's not diagnosing you with depression. It's just sort of picking up on trends that might be related to sadness, lack of well-being, et cetera. So there are people out there that are doing it. It's technically more difficult. It's ethically more difficult. There's greater privacy concerns, et cetera. So I think for now, we're kind of solving the easier problem, which are active assessments.
Yeah, it brings up a whole can of really interesting discussion points, which is probably, we've started to open the door on these, which is a really great thing. But, when you talk about the fact that, kind of with maybe an impression that people won't want to talk to their Alexa, there's actually lots of interesting data to support otherwise. For example, a lot of people who have cognitive behavioral issues, things like depression or other things that they would be considered embarrassing, a lot of studies are showing that these individuals feel a little safer and more open to speaking to a chatbot, like a Wobot or something that does cognitive behavioral therapy. And in fact, even befriending things like Replica, I'm sure you've heard of that company, where you have a friend who's actually all digital and there's like a safety and security of using that. With that kind of in mind, is that maybe perhaps a longer term perspective of maybe partnering APIs and leveraging the actual conversations taking place on some of these CBT algorithms?
Yeah, no, I completely agree that it does provide sort of a low friction way of collecting speech or language. And also it's a nice way of actually evaluating how well CBT is working for that specific patient. So that is something that's of interest. I think conversational AI is a whole other kettle of fish and a different set of technologies. And so that's a different skill set. But I think we would be very much interested in partnering with companies that are developing those tools. There's certainly a different data set though when people are typing messages versus talking. And there might be nuances that are created when humans speak to other humans or when there's a human around. But I think all those things are possible and could at least create a way of scaling healthcare, increasing access to CBT, et cetera.
One of the things I thought was very illuminating very recently is the leveraging of new platforms like I wouldn't say they're new, but Panorama, and I think Can Immunize. There's a lot of these new data registries that are coming up under the auspices of COVID-19. And it's no longer even asking the question from a bioethics standpoint. Is it okay if we collect your data and put it in a registry? It's now almost like, a fait accompli, which is we're just doing it and we're just letting you know that we are. So I really find that leapfrog on the bioethics conversation, which we were originally having with contact tracing, is no longer part of the conversation, but more, here's what we're doing. We're doing data registries. It's going to go pan-Canada, and everybody's going to be able to leverage this. Is this an opportunity that companies like Winterlight is going to be able to leverage for data lakes as it relates to specifically spoken word?
I would push back a bit and just I think COVID is exceptional. And I think there's so much urgency that I think people recognize that, we have to accelerate. But when it comes to speech, which is personally identifiable, and mental health conditions, which like there's still a lot of stigma associated with depression, schizophrenia, et cetera. There's a greater need for privacy and security. And even things like when you have someone that's depressed and they're talking, you can pick up suicidal ideation. And so you need a protocol in place to monitor that data. So all these things make it much more complicated to collect mental health data than, say, COVID data. So there are still challenges, but I agree though that digital health has really been accelerated by COVID and has like kind of reduced some of that friction, some of those concerns that you might get normally. But I'd say mental health is still tricky because of those challenges.
But I think it's really interesting, Liam, though, around the acceleration of healthcare scrutiny and everything else that's been going on since COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we're hearing, you just hear this over and over, even with the mayor of Toronto and the premier and everything else that's going on in Canada, as well as globally, is this concept of the increase in discomfort, depression, anxiety, and a whole series of other maladies that would be deemed in a big banner way as a mental health. Now, with that said, and the ability to potentially detect suicidal ideation, other sorts of things through voice, would that not accelerate the need or the prioritization on creating a patient registry so that you can almost help with population management, niching where greater centers of focus, care, funding should go? Is there not a case for that?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's kind of done piecemeal. There are different academic organizations affiliated with different disease areas. So there's one for Alzheimer's disease, one for depression. They kind of create these consortium where they collect these data sets. But what typically happens is it takes about a year or two to come to an agreement on what that study should look like. And then it takes another couple of years to collect the data. And so these are very long time horizons with mental health, especially things like dementia, where it's sort of insidious. There's a slow decline. So yeah, there are challenges, but I fully acknowledge though that these types of opportunities are becoming more and more widespread. I know at Harvard and places like that, they've done these very large data registries where people can log into a website, donate data effectively. And so there are opportunities like that. And we've been experimenting with online platforms to really expand data collection. Some of the caveats though are data quality. So with machine learning, what's incredibly important is the diagnostic label associated with that speech sample. And so if you collect the data from, say, a primary care setting, some of these diseases are misdiagnosed. And so you might have a speech sample from someone who has depression when in fact they have like mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. So that impacts the quality of the models. And when you're collecting from these very large online platforms, you're relying on self-reported data. So again, that reduces the quality further. And so there are these challenges and these trade-offs where you can get a lot of data, but it tends to be low quality, or you can get a very small amount of incredibly high quality data. And there's probably a balance between those two. Both have their value.
And how have you dealt with that? Because that is a really difficult balance to find as you're trying to teach your algorithms through different machine learning processes. And one of the key caveats with the high quality, sort of minimalized insertion of this data is data that could potentially be biased by a certain user clientele, language, accent, social economic status, and et cetera. How is Winterlight dealing with potentially biased voice data?
Yeah, so a couple ways. One is we're collecting data in clinical trials that are done across the world at hundreds of different clinical sites. So in different parts of the United States, Canada, Europe, et cetera. So that gives us some diversity there. Also, people are speaking different languages, different levels of education, et cetera. So that's certainly helpful. We are, putting together efforts to collect data outside of these clinical trials, as has been well documented. Clinical trials are relatively homogeneous as well, and so they're not perfect for capturing natural heterogeneity. And that's actually, this is a bit of a tangent, but one of the benefits of like remote decentralized clinical trials is that you make it easier to participate. And so you can get people that wouldn't normally be in clinical trials. The other part of the answer is that the way the technology is currently being used is not as a binary classifier. So does this person have Alzheimer's or not? When you have classifiers, you're really subject to that bias that you were talking about. But really the way the technology is being used right now is using people as their own baselines. So how do they change over time? And so by doing that, it's a bit more robust to some of those differences that you might get between people.
So what you're really saying is it's really comparing it to yourself. So starting off with a baseline and then watching longitudinally over time how that individual's voice is changing, and then making whatever classifiers, diagnoses, whatever, based on you as an N of one.
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
Interesting. So the question comes down to other kinds of studies that you're looking to collect. So I know that you're doing some things like healthy aging, depression studies. Tell us a little bit about who you're partnering with and what you're hoping to collect through these clinical studies.
Yeah, so really, like, data is the starting point for anything that we do. So anytime we want to go to a new therapeutic area, we need data. And when data has already been collected, it can be incredibly difficult to analyze that data. Patients need to provide consent to share with a third party. And so that can be really tricky. So what we often have to do is to do a prospective study, so do a study from scratch. We look to partner with academic clinicians at different hospitals. We're partnering with the hospital in New York right now, and different universities across Canada. And so that gives us the opportunity to collect very high quality data. Often we look for longitudinal data to look at how people change over time. We also look to partner with senior care companies, for instance. That can be a great way of collecting real world data sets. So there's a lot of different opportunities for data collection.
Beautiful, love it. And I guess the other question as well too is, as you're sort of exploring these different conditions, again, we just talked about COVID and depression and anxiety being a key thing. We want to be able to detect and see these. We were talking also that you're really comparing to your progression as a person and sort of determining effects on life on you over time. I guess the question comes down to is the tool, which is the voice analysis tool through Winterlight, is this really being used or viewed as more of a diagnostic? And or could this be used where there's call to action interventions as a way to augment or change that trajectory for that individual so they don't go down the path of something that would be considered more dire?
For sure, yeah. So I think digital biomarkers can have a variety of use cases. So whether it's looking at change over time, detecting a disease, changing the treatment outcomes, that's certainly a use case. I mean, obviously it depends on the therapeutic area. So for Alzheimer's disease, there's not a lot that can be done therapeutically right now. But for something like depression or schizophrenia, there is. And so some of our projects are looking at how do people change from week to week? Can we actually predict who's going to respond positively to a given therapy? Right now, it takes about 9 weeks to figure out if an antidepressant is going to work. Can we shorten that time to figure out if this antidepressant is going to be viable? So yeah, absolutely, there are different use cases with speech. And so we're, as part of these different collaborations that we're doing, we're starting to tackle these different questions. Or even, can you detect relapse in people with schizophrenia, for instance? So there's a lot of different use cases that I think touch on those points. And that's part of the challenges with digital biomarkers, is kind of narrowing the scope, because you can use it in many different therapeutic areas for many different use cases for different verticals, domains. And so picking a few that you think will have extra value or that are practical to do, et cetera.
And the reason for the question is, I see that you're doing some partnership work with therapeutics, which, as you know, have got some of their devices already approved through FDA as a, software as a medical device or digital therapeutic. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, could some of these speech technologies be used proactive, taught to act smart, to learn, and to start directing people in certain ways to preempt and potentially improve patient outcomes. If that's the case, is there consideration of using some of your clinical trials as, to be able to apply as a digital therapeutic with the FDA or Health Canada or whoever?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think right now there's a this challenge, which is when you have a psychiatric illness, you see your psychiatrist every 4 weeks or every 8 weeks. That's a long gap between visits, and so it's challenging for the physician to titrate your medication or change it based on that snapshot that they get every 4 to 8 weeks. And so by using a tool that you can either do daily or weekly, you can start to get much more high fidelity or high frequent data that you can start to use to tune that medication. And so it's certainly something that we're interested in. We know that digital therapeutic companies are also interested in that sort of more dynamic approach. With a lot of clinical trials that we're doing, they're in Alzheimer's disease, and so that approach only works if those therapies are successful, which I hope they are. But definitely it can be applied to some of these other areas that do have successful treatments.
What is the biggest challenges right now for Winterlight?
Right now we're at this nice to have problem, which is scaling. So we've grown really rapidly in terms of the inbound interest. So this time last year, we were closing 1 or 2 deals, and now we're closing about 5 or 6 deals. So there's been a huge increase in interest from pharmaceutical companies and beyond to use digital biomarkers and specifically speech. And so this is a challenge when you're growing like an R&D based company this quickly. And so just figuring out team structure, size, how do you accomplish these goals while still maintaining rigorous science, rigorous engineering practices. So I think scaling is sort of our biggest challenge right now. We've passed the point where the science was a risk, that's no longer a problem. We passed the point where we weren't sure if there was product market fit. We have that now. So we've achieved a number of very positive things over the past 12 to 18 months, but that sort of created a new set of challenges for us.
If you were to paint the picture of the perfect partner in a life science pharmaceutical company, who would that be right now that you would want to work with?
Most of those companies we actually are working with. So right now we work with 5 of the top 10 CNS pharma companies. So fortunately we've sort of achieved that. But I think really what we're looking to do is to plug the technology not just into one clinical trial or 2, but across all clinical trials, not just in central nervous system, but also in oncology, cardiology, et cetera, where in many of these clinical trials, they actually do cognitive assessments because they're looking at side effects, for instance. And so I think there's an opportunity to collect a lot more data and also help a lot more people. I mean, in oncology and a lot of these other areas, quality of life is really important. And we can measure things like depression, cognitive impairment through speech. So there could be an opportunity to measure some of these other variables that are really clinically meaningful to the patient as well.
Absolutely. And what is the future of natural language processing in your opinion?
It's really accelerated quite a bit over the last 5 years. Automatic speech recognition, which is sort of a core component to what we do, the accuracy has increased leaps and bounds just within 4 or 5 years. And so things that we didn't really think possible are clear that they probably will be possible within the next year or 2. And so I think this moment happened for images probably in 2012, and I think it's starting to happen now for natural language processing. And so the models are getting better, the data sets are getting bigger, the outcomes are getting better, the processing power is improving, and so all these things lead to better outcomes. So overall, I'm incredibly excited about what the next few years will yield.
And are things like GPT-3 and quantum computing, is this something that's exciting for what you're doing? Is this promising? Is it something that can be latched on to what Winterlight is doing?
Yeah, so we do use different types of language models. So one of the things that we do is we measure how coherent someone is. And so are they bouncing from topic to topic, which you might see in something like schizophrenia. And so effectively we use these sophisticated language models to measure the distance between these different sentences to kind of figure out how different they are, like how incoherent they are. So we do use models like that are pretty sophisticated, and we do evaluate every 3 to 6 months the new models, the state of the art. Quantum computing is still a bit in the sci-fi realm from my perspective. We're getting good results with more conventional computing. And also, I think you really require a different set of expertise to use some of these platforms. So I think that's still a few years out, but I acknowledge that there's been big changes in quantum computing over the past few years.
And I guess the any other kind of novel ideas or things, I guess, in the future that would be considered sci-fi, but you're seeing more and more coming at the helm today. Is there anything else that's sort of sitting there and that you're reading about, or that you think is going to have some impact on how we're managing patients with these kinds of conditions?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest announcements in the past couple of weeks was Google's DeepMind and their models in terms of understanding protein folding and protein structure and how they effectively solve that problem. And I think like what we saw in I think 2020 when the human genome was sort of fully mapped, and we kind of assumed that voila, we've kind of solved medicine, and took about 18 to 20 years for some of that research to actually yield dividends and start to treat patients. And I suspect we'll see some of the same things with some of these drug discovery AI engines and models that can detect protein structure that probably won't have a huge impact in the next year or two for the average patient. But in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they'll start to have a massive impact, and those gains will start to compound as well.
And we've heard a lot in the last several years also about things like CRISPR and gene editing and gene therapies and being able to map people's genomes. What about the folding in with language and detection and prediction? Is that something in the future as well?
I think, again, that goes back to our observation that there's this general interest in multimodal, deep phenotyping, behavioral phenotyping, and the way that we've diagnosed mental health disorders is incredibly coarse. And so coming up with these kind of like simple buckets to put people into. And I think like depression, for instance, there's like 9 core symptoms, and it's possible that you could have 2 people with depression and they only overlap on a single symptom. And so they can be very different types of people, and you can't treat them as the same. They might require different medicines or treatments, et cetera. And I think by using all these new technologies, whether it's digital biomarkers or gene mapping, et cetera, proteomics, that you'll start to better characterize people and put them into much more accurate buckets that are actually much more treatable, rather than in these very heterogeneous buckets that were created by people over the past 100 years where they just didn't have these technologies.
Fantastic. Where do you see the future of the patient? What is going to be the definition of a patient in the future? And is it going to look very different than how we view them today?
Yeah, I think the process for neurology and psychiatry will probably be a bit more sort of low friction. And what I mean by that is it'll probably be much easier to use tools to kind of figure out what's going well, what's not going well, figuring out what physician you should connect with, which therapy, whether that's like a conventional therapy or behavioral therapy, et cetera. So I think the golden age of neurology and psychiatry is just kind of starting right now, and will probably really hit its stride in the next 5 to 20 years. We made huge progress in things like oncology, and I think quickly, like we realized that neurology and psychiatry are probably the most difficult areas, but we're starting to make really big progress. Things like spinal muscular atrophy, where they've come up with cures effectively. And I think we'll start to see huge gains in Alzheimer's disease in the next 5 to 10 years as we move away from like the conventional amyloid hypothesis and start to figure out the actual causes for some of these diseases.
It's really interesting. It requires sometimes time for us to determine the effects of things like gravity. We actually have seen with some of the effects on the telomere lengths of some of the astronauts, on gravity, on things like that. It would be really interesting to see what the impact of COVID-19 is going to be on people's general ability to socialize and isolation. And I'm curious if any of this is going to translate in people's language and how they speak and how they do things in the future. I'm curious about your thoughts on what that world will look like as we become more and more isolated, become a world more of an ecosystem of convenience and not leaving our home and having everything delivered to us. How do you think that will impact us in the long term and perhaps come out in the inability to speak anymore?
Yeah, I think we inherently want to be around other humans, and there are people that are right now like going to parties because they want to be around humans so much that they're willing to risk it. Like it's selfish, but they're doing it. And so I think once it's acceptable to go to a party or see your family, I think people are just going to start to do it again. There might be that trepidation at first, that worry, but I think that's going to erode pretty quickly. With that said, there are a number of trends that I think will continue. And so I think more and more people will be ordering stuff online, and that will reduce some of those small interactions that people have. But I think generally though, people want to be out there and like having, you know, informal discussions on Zoom doesn't replace seeing someone at a conference and standing next to them and asking them about their kids or, you know, how their holidays were. And I think people crave that. And I know as someone in business, I look forward to actually interacting with our customers and the people that I work with day to day. So I think that's going to come back much quicker than we think. But on the other hand, I think remote work is here to stay for a lot of people. It's going to be hard for employers to tell their employees to come back and work in the office when they've been successful, you know, working remote for the last 12 months. So that's going to be hard, and that will probably change the dynamic. But I mean, the flip side, those people spend more time talking now because there's many more Zoom meetings than I think there were in-person meetings. So if anything, maybe makes us more articulate.
Only time will tell. I think this is actually a great positive note to land on our conversation. But really, really interesting stuff, Liam. I love what your company is doing. I love the laser focus and the fact that you are looking to create a platform with an ability for many different people working on many different conditions can start to look at. So I'm excited to watch what you're doing and some of the great studies and information of what's next with this. So for anybody listening or watching, we're going to be leaving some links for Liam himself personally, and as well as for his company. If anybody in the life sciences is interested in connecting, learning more, perhaps partnering, doing some studies, he's going to be available to do this. And also, we wouldn't mind you checking out impetusdigital.com. For those of you who are interested in this dialogue, wanting to speak to other stakeholders about things that are going beyond the pill. How do you extend, you know, your loss of exclusivity, or how do you start incorporating some of these cool, you know, digital biomarkers or digital therapeutics into your brands, or anything in between? How do you, you know, offshoot some new things that you're doing with your brands? We do that through longitudinal touch points, asynchronously and synchronously through our online platform. We'd love to hear from you. Please check us out. Like this video or subscribe so other people can find this information as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Liam, it has been a blast. Thank you so much, and happy holidays to you and your family, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you.